absolutely all-star panel for a discussion on the Canadian competition policy for the platform economy. While we are still in a hybrid pandemic environment, the Canadian IGF All Hands Committee hopes to return these sessions to in-person meetings so that we can have the opportunity to chat in the hallway over coffee and have the in-person interactions that we all miss. Before I introduce our panelists today, I'd like to set the stage about recent developments in the competition policy space and what we are looking ahead to in the latter half of the year. For a few years now, the competition policy debate in Canada has been heating up, with tension mounting as we head towards the next milestone, a public consultation about how to modernize the Competition Act for the digital age. Last October, Senator Whetstone opened a consultation in which participants responded to a discussion paper about whether digital markets present distinct features that necessitate changes to competition law, which some of today's panelists participated in. This consultation demonstrated the range of perspectives that are present in the Canadian competition policy debate today, which the senator summarized as being threefold. 1, the status quo position for targeted revisions. 2, a neo-Brandisian populist position. And 3, a European model of balancing priorities. Participants of this consultation in the first camp, the status quo, largely advocated that the Competition Act is fit for purpose for the digital age, and that targeted revisions, such as clarifying the purpose of the Act to explicitly pursue economic competition or amending the abuse of dominance provisions, are sufficient, as opposed to more drastic changes. In the described neo-Brandisian camp, participants aligned for the most part on the belief that the unchecked dominance of big tech companies has stifled innovation, created barriers to entry in important markets, and subjected small businesses to unfair anti-competitive behavior. These characteristics are a direct result of the size, power, and intelligence of tech giants. What remains unknown in this camp is whether the social impacts coming from their dominance, like economic inequality and privacy issues, should be addressed via competition policy or through other areas of law in tandem. Participants umbrellaed in the third European model articulated that competition is linked to social, political, and environmental problems, and that ex-ante regulation that encourages pro-competitive processes instead of targeting outcomes is better than the current Canadian enforcement model. The Whetstone consultation, of course, has left many questions unanswered. A lot has happened since then as well. In February, Innovation, Science, and Economic Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced a two-step plan for competition policy reform, including a comprehensive modernization of the Act. Some reforms have been folded into the Budget Implementation Bill, the BIA. These amendments include an expansion of the scope of abuse of dominance, an expansion of the types of conducts that private parties can bring to the competition tribunal, and the expansion of the Act's cartel provisions to include wage fixing and no-poach agreements, among others. Next, and what our conversation today can serve as a launching pad for, is a promised comprehensive modernization of the Act. Commissioner of Competition Matthew Boswell promised at a panel by the Centre for International Governance Innovation that there will be an important round of public consultations on competition policy that will no doubt act as a stepping stone to the modernization of the Act coming from Minister Champagne. Commissioner Boswell encouraged all Canadians to participate in this consultation because competition policy intersects with other areas like privacy and the environment and has tangible effects on something on every Canadian's mind: price. Before we begin our panel discussion, I have just a few housekeeping items to address. First of all, I'd like to let you know that we're recording today's session as we are live broadcasting on YouTube. Also, for viewers who would like to watch in French, please tap the world icon and choose French. The chat window is open for comments. Please remain respectful in your interactions. Also, ensure that you have everyone selected and not just panelists before sending a message. We also encourage you to take this discussion outside the event and to social media. You can use the hashtag CIGFTalks. Lastly, please submit any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A tab, also located in the bottom of your Zoom window. Questions asked in the chat will not be answered by the panelists. There will also be an opportunity to ask live questions at the end of the event by raising your hand. Please ensure your mic is working correctly in order to ask a live question. And now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists. You can find their full bios and CVs on the CIGF website. But just very briefly, we are joined today by Vas Bednar, Executive Director of the Masters of Public Policy and Digital Society at McMaster University. We are also joined by Elisa Carney, who is a partner at Davies, Ward Phillips and Weinberg LLP, where she specializes in competition and foreign investment law. Next up, we have John Lawford, Executive Director and General Counsel at the Public Interest Advocacy Center in Ottawa. And last but certainly not least, we have John Peckman, the former Commissioner of Competition at the Competition Bureau Canada. He is currently a Senior Business Advisor to Fasken. Thank you so much for joining us all. So to kick things off, I'm going to start with sort of a very, very broad question, but it is kind of the obvious one. Is the Competition Act fit for purpose for the 21st century? So John, I wonder if maybe as the former commissioner, you'd like to weigh in on that one.
I would happy to do so, Alex. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the CIGF for the invitation. I want to begin by making a disclaimer. The comments I'll be making today are my own. They do not represent the views of Fasken or its clients. So that gives me an ability to speak a bit more freely. So I'm looking forward to this important discussion at this important time. As Commissioner Boswell said, Canada needs more competition, and the best way to do that is to modernize and strengthen the competition laws of our country. And I'm a huge believer that the laws do need to be strengthened. However, I do fit into the Howard Weston Camp 1 status quo with targeted reform camp quite firmly, and for a number of reasons. And I'll go back to cycle back to when I was commissioner in 2018. Near the end of my term, we did release a white paper on big data that asked that exact question. Are the laws under the current Competition Act sufficient to deal with anti-competitive behavior? And the answer was generally yes, primarily because big data and data-driven markets were not entirely new. Data has been being collected for years, loyalty cards, and part of that, banks and telcos and other companies were using data to target advertising and letters or whatever to their customers. So this practice has been going on for some time. And the Competition Bureau was successful in taking on some anti-competitive behavior in digital markets, such as the TREB case, where the real estate board was withholding data from its members who were looking to put on an online service. And that matter was challenged before the courts. And ultimately, the Bureau prevailed, and that data was made available to the real estate agents in the Toronto area. So that is just a quick example. There are many, many other cases. So the Act can apply. There's also the fact that it does have a very good core of economic analysis for law enforcement that tries to bring around some predictability and how it's going to be applied. It balances the need for taking action against anti-competitive behavior while not chilling innovation and dynamic competition. So, it doesn't go after companies just because they're large. I mean, if you're large and you engage in anti-competitive behavior, yes, you are a target of you can be a target of the Competition Bureau and potentially an order by the tribunal. So all this to say is, yes, that was the position in 2018. And what's the Bureau's position today? We opened with the Weston consultations. The Bureau made a very comprehensive submission focusing on digital markets. And in that submission, clearly it did not call for any substantive changes to the framework of the Competition Act. It was putting forward targeted changes to the legislation it thought it needed to be a more effective regulator and more effective in taking on antitrust issues in the digital economy. I truly believe with some substantive changes, such as the ability of the Bureau to work more quickly, like lowering injunction standards, quicker adjudication, allowing for arbitration type processes, having code of conducts that allow for digital companies to work out some of the issues, first of all, themselves, and then have oversight by the Bureau. I think there can be a lot can be done in this space without having to move to heavy-handed regulation, where some jurisdictions have thought it may be the better way to go forward. So I firmly fall in Camp 1. I'm a fan of the Competition Act, the way it was structured in 1986. It was modern. It relies on economic evidence. There's been a significant amount of jurisprudence developed. There's no need to throw this all out. There's a lot of guidance on the proposed legislation. Let's tweak it. Let's fix it. Let's make it work better, and then we can take on some of the issues better in the digital economy.
Thank you, John. Vas, what do you think? Do you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective?
I mean, I generally agree. So if I can just contextualize myself too, I'm happy to do a disclaimer too, right? In that though I work most of the time at McMaster University, my contributions to the broader debate, these are side of desk, night, weekend kind of research papers. I'm not an expert on Canadian competition. I haven't worked at the Bureau. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an economist. But I like to think that I'm good at asking good questions, making some connections, and facilitating some of the debate. And Alexandra, to your opening comments, when you noted, you said a T word, tension. And I wonder how much of that tension in terms of the broader debate on competition reform in Canada is like real or imagined, right? A lot is lost in digital. And this panel is really unique because we actually get to talk to and with each other instead of past each other or through each other or, you know, in a volleyball of op-eds in the National Post. So I think where there's consensus or right, because like, and that's public debate too, and it engages people in a particular way. But maybe I can share some observations in terms of is the Competition Act fit? You know, sometimes it seems like a lot is riding on the shoulders of this piece of legislation and is by no means a magic wand, or is it going to solve kind of all of the challenges we're feeling? So if I can throw kind of two bits of imagery into our conversation, the first is Shaggy. So remember the song Shaggy, It Wasn't Me? I don't know how he got away with this song. It's quite a silly one. But, you know, a lot of the entry points to the broader competition conversation, and I know we're not talking about banking or telecom, we're talking about the platform economy, but maybe the traditional entry points for Canadians have these additional dairy, right? Dairy, supply chain management, have these additional regulatory layers. So then we have a narrative that sort of says, listen, the deficiencies you're seeing here in those marketplaces are not really, you know, due to a weak or an under-enforced Competition Act. It's these other layers of government regulation. So let me put forward this other kind of maybe way to think about the broader conversation, which is the infamous game from Wheel of Fortune, Plinko, right? I think it's useful to kind of start with what is a harm in the platform economy that we think would be better solved or addressed or makes for a case that our Competition Bureau should be taking on that it isn't. And I think part of why the conversation is accelerating is maybe due more to international, broader conversations that Canada is not quite a part of, but we're sort of seeing a spillover here. I think people were surprised when there were those initial amendments you mentioned in the Budget Implementation Act, because we hadn't been having a bigger conversation about these, right? We didn't have a conversation about competition just last year. I know what is time, I always forget, but I know that we had a federal election last year too. And actually the Conservative platform was one of the only ones speaking about it. So, you know, I'm in a, if I have the luxury of finally putting myself into some sort of camp, because I'm often colored or gestured or plinkoed myself into a school of thought, it's to cite that the Competition Bureau and the Act itself is hurt by the lack of an overarching vision in Canada about the role of data in our digital economy and what's appropriate in terms of where and how firms compete. And I think we're seeing that especially on the heels of the Tim Hortons investigation, right? Maybe we'll talk more about that, maybe we won't, but some of the work I've put forward, and I'll stop talking, I'm talking way too much. I'm sorry, I'm a bad panelist, I feel now. You know, talking about the behaviors themselves, self-preferencing, gatekeeping, copycatting, wage fixing is one of the first questions we should and can be asking is like, is the Competition Act the best tool to address that problem? We're not having a referendum on the problems themselves. We're sort of saying, is that best addressed through this piece of legislation? Do we have other tools or other schools of thought? And that's a bigger conversation. So I will end by also acknowledging it's a tough conversation to join, right? It can feel like you don't belong, or it's very nuanced. But hopefully, to echo John's comments and what we've previously heard from Commissioner Boswell, we'll be able to do a better job framing this debate, right? Because it's not just mechanical, it's also becoming very philosophical for Canada. And I think that's exciting.
Absolutely. So let's go to the other John, and thank you, Bass, for your thoughtful comments. Do you agree? Do you think that, this is the right piece of legislation to address all of these issues? And if you were to put yourself into a camp, which would it be?
Well, to answer the question, is it fit for purpose? I'll say no. I'd say PIAC, rather than myself, believes that we're sort of in the Lena Khan second, whatever you're calling it, neo-Brandeisian. That's just a long way to say it. So I'll just say Lena Khan camp with a little bit of the EU sort of prior constraint option there for a couple of reasons. I think the big change for consumers over the last few years is it is actually the platforms. What do the platforms do? First of all, they're a closed market, pretty much. I mean, you come in there and you buy your stuff on the Apple Store or on Amazon or whatever, and it has certain network effects, but it is controlled by one entity. And then secondly, you have really heavy use of privacy, as Vass alluded to, which is a new currency for consumers. You're paying in personal knowledge about yourself and profiling. And I think if you honestly acknowledge that, as it makes up most of the valuation of some of these platforms, then I think that gives you a key to understanding what needs to be done. So there's unique new consumer harms coming out of platforms. One is, platforms that won't let certain other companies onto their platform. And then there's other platforms that will take new ideas if they're offering third-party services, and they will then produce a copycat. That's one of the things we might be talking about, product, and sell that cheaper and undermine their own suppliers on the platform and take the profits 100% for themselves. Those sorts of things tend to look like abusive dominance. They look like a monopoly. So it's kind of the quacks like a duck argument. And it's hard to quantify the consumer losses and harms, but I think in particular in the United States, that's the development that's driving all of this discussion. We have the report from the House of Representatives from Jerry Nadler's committee saying, here's the bad things that Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on have done as platforms to consumers. That got taken up by Joe Biden's recent policy direction to the whole government to take a whole of government approach, in fact, to competition law and to be more aggressive and to cooperate between the departments. Now, I haven't seen that kind of announcement out of Champagne's office yet, but I think our review of the Act is pretty much following that US lead, as well as the EU steps for the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. So we're kind of playing catch up as usual, but we are a secondary market. I mean, to be honest, Canada's sticking up their hand and saying Google and Fitbit shouldn't merge, for example, would be kind of ineffective if the US didn't do it, or Europe. So that's where I'm coming from on this, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, because when you get into the fine details, I could even live with tinkering, as John is saying, provided I got what I want. I've got a little shopping list there, but we have a lot of reform to do in Canada. I think that's fair from a consumer point of view.
Well, I hope that we can get into some of the finer details of your shopping list. But for now, I will pass the floor over to Elisa for your take.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. We certainly have a lot to unpack. Even in these introductory remarks, you can see where this conversation is going to go. Let me begin by making a similar disclaimer as John, and just say that I am here on this panel in my individual capacity, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my law firm or any clients that we may represent. I also should give Vass a shout out. It's the first time we've been on a panel where any pop culture reference made any sense to me. And I actually do know Shaggy, but usually it goes right over my head. So I feel like I'm in good company. I think one thing Vass said I would maybe not take issue with, but expand a little upon, and that is that the conversation hasn't been happening in Canada. I mean, as John pointed out, the Bureau has been talking about this for a long time. And I do think the Bureau should actually be commended for being one of the organizations that started this discussion early, and perhaps too early with the way that the conversation has gone. But the Bureau has been thinking about these issues, and the paper that they put out a number of years ago is maybe no longer on the mark and needs to be reassessed and rediscussed. And I think now that we have more people and a diversity of voices and views into this discussion, we will end up perhaps in a different place. But I don't think we should dismiss that the Bureau itself has actually given quite a lot of thought to the platform economy and the importance of data, et cetera, over the last number of years. So where do I stand on this debate? I think this is complex, and I think bottom line is I do agree with John. There's a lot that can be done with the institutions that already exist. We don't need to recreate the wheel, but there are ways that we can make this better. And I think the discussion that's going to take place over the course of the next 6 months or a year will certainly do that. But I also think we need to be very precise and deliberate in our discussions. So let's just start with the topic of this panel. We're speaking about competition policy for the platform economy. Are we talking about the digital economy writ large? Are we talking only about the platform economy? Are we talking about certain dominant platforms in the platform economy? Because depending on what we're talking about, the answer is actually very, very different. The platform economy is extremely diverse. There are platforms where there are more tend to oligopolies. There are platforms where there is significant competition. And so if we think about our daily lives, we can go through app stores, retail platforms, riding share, taxi platforms, hotels. And in some markets, you can mention 1, 2, or 3. And in others, there's certainly a huge diversity where that switching and multi-homing, I think, is more prevalent. But I think John Lawford made a good point that underlying most, if not all of these platforms is this notion of data. And there, I think we have to consider 2 things. There's the use of consumer data and the privacy and consumer issues that John mentioned. And then there's also data as an input. It may not be consumer data. It may be a different input. And I think the issues that we are trying to address in both of those instances are different. And some may be better suited for competition law, and some may not. And so I think we do need to keep that in mind. Certainly, I agree with John that both Johns, but certainly with John Lawford, that these data-driven business models have created challenges around transparency and consumer privacy. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that the broader discussion that Vas mentioned is tackling. But I don't think we can deny, as John Peckman said, that the platform economy has also driven innovation and efficiency. And the purpose of competition in the economy is to drive innovation and efficiency. And the purpose of the Competition Act is to maintain competition. So is the act itself fit for purpose? Can it maintain and encourage the competition in data-driven markets? Can it address new forms of market power? I think the answer is yes. Should the regulatory capacity be improved? That's a question that has been asked, partially addressed, and I think the answer to that is yes. To John Lawford's point, I do think that new vehicles are required to address transparency issues. I think information asymmetries can be addressed through consumer protection. And I think there are ways to modernize our competition law with better integration between competition law, privacy, and consumer protection. But what I don't agree with is that we should be coming at this, as John Peckman mentioned, from the perspective that big is necessarily bad, and that introducing a per se or ex ante or deontological prohibited conduct and imposing billions of dollars of AMPs is going to get us the answer that we're looking for. I think we need to be looking at ways to improve the platform economy without stifling innovation, and also the pro-competitive evolution of the platforms that exist today and those that are going to emerge in the future. I think I also agree with some of the commentaries and the Vivek report that was used as part of the Weston consultation noted this, that we do need to explore whether the current substantial lessening of competition standard, which is generally looked at as higher prices, lower quality or lower innovation, is the right standard in the digital economy. It may be something less, and I think that will be an important part of the conversation that will come up. But I strongly feel from a policy perspective that introducing a sort of per se prohibited conduct for certain platforms or all platforms is not the way to take the direction of the legislation.
Perfect. Thank you. So a few of you touched on this already, but I want to get more into this sort of idea of privacy. And so do you think that, the Competition Act should be changed to include other goals such as privacy? And if it was, what would that mean for the Bureau's relationship with other agencies, such as the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, for example? So maybe I'll just throw that one to Vas. I know you kind of touched on this.
I was trying to just stay very still in case you'd pick someone else first. You know, I think it goes to Elisa's point around, some integrations and connections, right? So I'm not a proponent of kind of stuffing every economic goal we might have, or that one economic goals that might ebb and flow as our political leadership changes into the purpose statement of the Competition Act. But again, I think what starves the act and starves Canada is, that lack of an overarching articulation of the optimal role for data in our economy, right? You see that with the previously proposed privacy legislation that I know you've discussed at length through your organization. How do we balance consumer protection, and informing people and transparency with the ability for firms to innovate and do cool new things that are interesting, right? And in the absence of that articulation, in that vacuum, what happens is we allow certain business behaviors to flourish or become more ubiquitous. And then when we're retroactively deciding kind of somewhat suddenly that they're harmful to the economy or harmful to competition, I also think that's adds a problematic layer, right? Because even with, and I'm not beating up on Tim Hortons, I hope, by bringing them up, but I think it's an interesting example, right? Because did we have a firm enough articulation of what proportionality was in that privacy context, and what were the competition effects of them being able to surveil their users and know when they purchased a Starbucks, et cetera, et cetera? Is that part of the conversation that we want to have? So, I've written about
and just very
some of the
quickly for anyone
connections.
who didn't
Yeah.
follow the Tim Hortons thing, it was that their app was
Oh,
kind of monitoring you regardless of where you were and what you were doing.
you are a great moderator. Yes. Yeah. There was a little bit of greediness perhaps with their data collection. But again, back to John mentioning that early paper, 2008, that we had different attitudes towards big data, right? There was, wow, look at these new possibilities. Look how our computational power is increasing. This is fascinating. We can do new things. And maybe we can't get truly informed consent because we're not sure what we're going to do with this information, but we know that it's valuable and we want to leverage it, and we want to, have more targeted advertising, or I'm sure Tim Hortons is using some interesting information, or at least some kind of advertising firm that's, why are they partnering with Justin Bieber? They must have had data that shows they're not that popular with young people. Am I right? This is not a competition conversation. Vast, stop talking about Tim Hortons. But I think I will end by saying, and thank you to Senator Weston for the consultation that he led, and the ideas he was able to surface and collect, and for the work of also kind of trying to harmonize those and take on that summary report. I think it was really intriguing that the Privacy Commissioner, wrote into that. So perhaps I'll end by noting that it's currently very difficult, if not impossible, for a case related to, and John Peckman's going to be like, Vass, you're so wrong on this. I might be wrong, but what I want to put forward is that it's actually, these conversations end up staying theoretical because we don't have comparable cases in Canada where we've actually tested either the behaviors themselves, et cetera, under the Act. And part of that could be because of our evidentiary burden. I don't want to say that you don't need to have good evidence about those competitive effects, right? But part of why that Tim Hortons investigation was able to happen was because under our privacy legislation, a journalist could access the data that a firm had. So are there also interesting kind of barriers or tensions that make it impossible for us to kind of to truly test the presumed flexibility of the Act as it stands? I hope that's not too rambling. I think that's part of the broader conversation. I know you asked me about privacy and competition. So quick answer, we don't need to, it's not a magic wand to put other goals into that purpose statement. It's very unique, but I think it's a productive conversational vehicle to be like, what are our goals and how does this piece of legislation fit into that goal?
Mm-hmm. I think natural to throw here too, John Peckman, this is your chance to dispute Vass. Oh, and you're on mute.
I win the money, don't I? I bet it was going to be me. So I'm going to use the Shaggy reference as well, and I'd say Vass's answer was bombastic, and I'm going to give a response that's a little more like Bob Seger, like a rock, in terms of dealing with this issue. I know we got off on a tangent on Tim Horton. I mean, that falls clearly under privacy legislation. There's competition issue as far as I'm concerned. The analogy being, no, I mean, Tim Hortons, I mean, it's not about competition. It's the fact that they're doing this practice. It's not against a competitor. There's no competition issue per se, in my view. It's basically a pure privacy play. And the Privacy Act is set up to deal with that, although it is very weak and it needs to be upgraded and updated. And they've tried in Parliament, but they need to get to the GDPR levels that are kind of the standard now around the world. And we're not there, and there are no penalties under our privacy legislation either. It's just name and shame. So I think there needs to be a facelift there on a priority basis, in my view. And how does that play with the Purpose Act of the Competition Act, the Purpose Clause? And again, this is my status quo, old guy, gray hair. I kind of like our Purpose Clause, but for one element of it, it's pretty wide ranging. Completely supported by the Competition Bureau. Again, in its submissions to the Weston process, it said it didn't see the need to change the Purpose Clause whatsoever, because it is flexible enough to deal with a wide variety of issues, whether it's competitive markets, lower prices, small and medium enterprises, exports, and efficiencies. That's a lot to capture in one piece of legislation. Difficult to think why it should capture more pieces of legislation or policy in one, in a competition law. That's my personal point of view. It's old school. Stay in our lane. Competition policies to stay in its lane. Where I do have one little bit of a concern right now, one could read into the Purpose Clause that it suggests that efficiencies should be paramount. And again, I'm not so sure that is current for today. I think that needs to be looked at, particularly given the efficiencies that are involved in the digital economy. It does kind of render the competition side of the antitrust side of the House a bit, mute. It makes it difficult to advance cases because the efficiencies are so high when you're involved with the digital economy. Given the economies of scope, scale, network effects, that there's efficiencies. There's all kinds of efficiencies there, and where they're in play and are counted against harm, it's hard for competition to prevail. So my thinking is there's to be a hard look at that in the context of the current economy. With the old bricks and mortar, where economies of scale were important, so we can compete internationally. That was the reason that was highlighted, in my view. Again, I'm not sure it served that purpose. Anytime this claim was made, for the most part, we dealt with domestic industries, had nothing to do with exports. It was a bit abused in the context of merger review. But with the intersection with privacy, now, again, we've seen the Competition Act already take action against Facebook as a backstop on the matter that involves Cambridge Analytica. There was ultimately a $9 million penalty imposed on Facebook. It was more for show, to show that Canada, will stand up as well. I mean, the other jurisdictions imposed billions of dollar fines. So I don't know what more we could have done. There was a significant penalty imposed. We were just the Me Too at the end. But we had to use competition law because our privacy laws don't have a remedy of a penalty, an administrative penalty. And so the Competition Bureau stood up and took a bit of a lead on that issue, although I understand the OPC still in court with Facebook on issues surrounding that particular filing. But the Competition Act does consider privacy when it looks at the qualitative effects of a merger, when it's looking at abuse of dominance in terms of the harm. Is there a harm on quality? A harm on quality would be a reduction in privacy. So the Act currently allows review of those types of issues. And I think On the antitrust side, that's as far as it should go. On the consumer protection side, it's the deceptive and marketing practices, using privacy and being deceptive about your privacy rules for a company. Again, overlaps a bit with the Privacy Commission's mandate, and we see this overlap in the anti-spam legislation, where both the Competition Bureau, the Privacy Commissioner, and the CRTC all have a role to play in stamping out spam. And of course, the Bureau's role is on the deceptive marketing side. And I think that type of collaboration can be set up on the consumer protection side of privacy. I think there needs to be some work on that. But on the antitrust side, as I said, I believe the Act already captures privacy when it's harmed by anti-competitive behavior.
I agree with you on the spam calls. I really would love for those to stop. In fact, I just got one while this panel was going on. Let's toss it over to John Lawford. Do you think that privacy should be a goal? And to any of the panelists, feel free to kind of weigh in on the efficiencies defense as well, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you. I'd just say I think you can go farther as a competition regulator, and in particular, I would posit Amazon as it functions now when it's not doing anything illegal. They have massive amounts of consumer buying preference information, and I'll just quote for you from Lena Kahn's paper, because I think she says it best. For the purpose of competition policy, one of the most relevant factors of online platform markets is they are winner-take-all, due largely to network effects and control over data, both of which mean early advantages become self-reinforcing. And the result is technology platform markets which yield dominance to a small number of firms. So that is the problem. And if they have this self-reinforcing funnel, which works as it should, at what point does a regulator step in and say, you are too big? Here, Elise, I'm saying maybe there is no such thing as too big. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, Lisa, so you can come back at me. But I think that is the problem. When things are working just fine, it causes problems. And what's the harm of putting a privacy lens over it in the sense of, as you're saying, John, a non-price effect or a non-price element in the analysis, which is privacy control and data about pricing preferences? Like, for me, we've always fought at PIAC individualized pricing, because when you have individualized pricing, of course, there's no more consumer surplus. And we like things like tariffs, where the company doesn't know how much I'm willing to pay for my internet service, because then they have to offer it at $90. And if I'm willing to pay $120, they'll never know, because the tariff or the price in the market is $90 if they don't have perfect information. But if they have perfect information on how much John Lawford is going to pay, John Lawford is going to pay $120. And all that consumer surplus in the market gets soaked up. And I just find it interesting that in other contexts, the Bureau thinks that it's important to have some consumer surplus in a market. I'm not an economist, so I can't go into whether, these deadweight loss and all this sort of thing that happens. But I can say that from a consumer affordability point of view and from a consumer choice point of view, these sort of dynamics, I think, are what the US people are trying to get at. And therefore, I think a privacy lens like that could certainly live inside the Competition Commission, over and above when people do bad things with privacy.
So, John, can I respond, if you don't mind, on this buying preference information? I think I mentioned that during our 2018 study. Buying preference information has been collected for years and years and years by major corporations, so they can target their products and develop new products for consumers, so they can meet demand. Amazon is just one player in retail. There's Walmart. There's all kinds of other major retailers in Canada, Canadian Tire, Loblaws. They're all collecting buyer information so they can provide better service to consumers. Customers love, these retailers when they are able to do that. Again, I'm trying to figure out where the harm is. Where's the blood? Where's the blood?
When there's only one drugstore in Canada, Shoppers Drug Mart, because they have all the information and they've killed everybody else off. When there's only one platform to buy stuff, Amazon, because everything else is dead. That's why.
Yeah, but I'll jump in. But they're not. There's not only just one. Sorry.
Yeah, I've written a tiny bit about this. Yeah, it's not only just one. So, I mean, I've written a tiny bit about this, and I think this is an interesting case to bring up, right? Because one, though it's underexplored in other jurisdictions, mentioning the Facebook case reminds us that one, when there's international kind of changes or shifts, Canada can potentially benefit from the spillover effects. But two, when there are Canadian firms kind of leading the way or taking those on. No other competition authorities or privacy authorities, et cetera, are going to kind of do our homework for us. And John Lawford, maybe what you're getting at a little bit is kind of the hyper-personalized pricing that we're seeing data being used for, where there's not always, as Elisa mentioned, the transparency or the consumer protection aspect, right? So yes, data, we've been using data for a long time to understand optimal pricing, what's a competitive price, what's the marketplace, how do you benchmark there? But a different reality, and this isn't necessarily anti-competitive or inefficient, is that us shopping online, and I wish I was like smart enough that we could do a fun demo or something, that we're all going to get a different, slightly different price pitched to us, right? And when the marketplace is more of an algorithmic hall of mirrors, that's difficult. It's difficult for competitors and it's difficult for consumers, and it raises issues. And those are policy issues that we can discuss that may not be best addressed through the Competition Act, but are nonetheless deserving of our attention. So maybe that's where some of my perspective is. No, I'm not refuting you or anything. I'm just trying to jump in with my, I guess, impassioned perspective. I've written a little bit about it. There was a cool report, if anyone listening wants to look, done in partnership with the Mozilla Foundation and Consumer Protection International, or some. That's kind of what they do, and they looked at differential pricing for the Tinder platform. So people receiving the same service, but in different jurisdictions based on their age, location, blah blah blah. Their gender as well, they were, quoted a different price for certain services on the app. And is that something we're aware of, or is that something we know is happening, or that we need more information about? Is it hidden in the terms of service? Again, it's a related issue when I think we're talking about everything that can fit under a big bucket of platform economy, how we engage online and competition. And then it puts us in that Plinko situation where we can kind of talk about what tools do we have. Are we using the existing tools as best we can? Do we need new tools, new partnerships, and then how can we improve the legislation?
So if I can jump in here. So look, I think we're very, very interesting conversation, but again, I think we're having two different conversations. And the way that the question was posed from Alexandra was whether or not the Competition Act should have as a goal privacy. And I think John Peckman addressed that slightly different than the way John Lawford, you're coming at it. So on the privacy point, at the goal of privacy, I agree with John, except for one comment. I know we say the Bureau should stay in its lane, and I agree that privacy should not be a goal in and of itself under the Competition Act. But I do think there is more of a role for the Competition Bureau to play in this interagency coordination that we were talking about. I mean, that transparency and control of data is an issue that needs to be addressed by multiple agencies, domestically and internationally. In a global economy, we can't do this on our own. John, you made reference to this. Like, we have to see what's going on elsewhere. And so there, I do think staying in your lane is inconsistent with this whole of government approach. And I do think the government needs to, Vas, as you say, what is the vision? And we need an overarching, whether it's an institution or a person or a data commission or something, to kind of address that point. But John and Peckman also agree with you that those are not really antitrust issues. I think the antitrust issues were what John Lawford was speaking about. And John, I wouldn't characterize those as privacy issues, but I certainly would characterize them as antitrust issues. And there, I think you have hit on what is a very important future discussion on the remedies that are available if an antitrust problem has been identified. And now that comes back to the discussion of what is the anti-competitive effect and what is our standard? And is it what it is today of a substantial lessening of competition or something less? So I think all of those comments that you raised will become an important part of the discussion in the next phase, where we think about the role of data silos, interoperability, maybe even data trusts, portability as a remedy in a situation where market power has been identified and an anti-competitive effect on the economy has been found.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to actually skip ahead here to question number 4, seeing as we are tight on time, and I do want to make sure we get to some audience questions. And just a reminder for the audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please just pop them in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear them. And so I guess I want to kind of talk about, we've seen these two different models emerge. in one model, such as in the EU, it's sort of inventing new regulators. And then in the other model, like in the UK, it's more about sort of reinvigorating existing regulators and using these sort of coordinating committees. So how do these models speak to Canada, and which of them do you think is kind of more appropriate for our market? And I'll maybe toss this one to John Peckman first.
Thank you. So I think we need to go back even further. I know some of the jurisdictions have adopted different models. I'm still at the first question. Are digital platforms common carriers? Is there there have been a number of studies, whether it be in Europe, the US, the Stigler study, Furman study in the UK, the European studies, and none of them have found market failure requiring regulation. They've found market power. There's been a market power issue, but there's been no finding of a market failure requiring regulation. So, the jurisdictions that have moved to regulating competition in this area, in my mind, have made a big jump because, again, for purposes of efficiency, it's very easy, in my mind, to deal with the complex issues of economic analysis just through a regulation saying, if you're a certain market share and you engage in this conduct, you can't do it, it's prohibited. It's a very simple way of, regulating an economy. But is it the right way? Is it going to stifle innovation? Is it going to stifle growth? Is it going to stifle investment? Why will companies go into a market when you're going to be stopped because you're successful? You have to have this balancing approach. So when I look to Europe, I think they've jumped the gun. I like what the UK has done. Quite frankly, the CMA, further to the Furman report, they've done a market study by their competition authority. And they've developed a digital markets unit that has created, a mandatory code of conduct approach that is working with industry to develop rules, like what's onside, what's offside, given the unique business models here, and have the competition authority oversee the rule implementation of the rules. I mean, that to me is the happy medium. The U.S. is going into a sort of a hybrid approach, with the current Klobuchar bill. Again, where they're looking at ex-ante regulation for large platform companies if they engage in prohibiting certain conduct. Again, not doing any analysis of whether or not it is truly harmful. It's saying, well, the studies seem to suggest it is, and therefore we're going to make it, outlaw it. And as a result, they can't go ahead with whether it's self-preferencing or other types of potentially exclusionary conduct. My view is that conduct can already be tackled under the U.S. legislation and Canadian legislation. There's the abusive dominance provision has a list of anti-competitive acts. It's not exhaustive. A bureau could argue at any point in time these discriminatory practices or these exclusionary practices are anti-competitive. They'd have to show they substantially lessen competition. So in my mind, I think the law should be tightened a bit on this front. But currently, as it's written, our law, quite frankly, can tackle some of the reasons why we see regulation in Europe, why we see codes of conduct in Britain and pending bills before the US. So I haven't been sold in the first instance that we have market failure and there is a need to regulate tech platforms at this point in time. I just think it's been a narrative. It's been a quick way to get to a political solution. And it just gives you a taste of the power that the commission has in Europe. Judge, jury, executioner, and politician. She's commissioner. The commissioner is a minister and is a vice president of the EU. Very powerful body, and it was with minimal debate. They had some debate, but I think we should be careful going forward. Keep an eye on how they're making out. We will watch some of the end runs that will be done by the tech companies around this legislation, and it'll ultimately, I believe, hurt small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to get caught in the crossfire. But that's my personal view. We'll have to wait and see. But I think this is worthy of a large discussion. I can't wait to have these consultations where we get everyone's views so we can hash it out and come up with a reasonable, Canadian, made in Canada approach. Let's not just cut and paste from the US or the EU. Let's come up with a Canadian solution is my view.
So much for a chill summer, eh? I mean, if I can chase John as a speaker, I really appreciate him pointing to the different processes that different jurisdictions have gone and also different powers of the people who were making those decisions. Because when it comes to should we layer in something new that your core question, should we layer in something new, or do we, could we do a better job with what we have? I think that comes down to the research and statements that we want to make, again, in Canada, in a Canadian context, that are true to the spirit that we've historically brought to competition, and also our findings from debate and consultation and kind of taking a more inclusive approach. Canada has an opportunity to learn from these other jurisdictions that are moving a little faster, experimenting, right? And we can use that to our advantage, and we should. And we also are in an environment where we're kind of offering a facelift to some other kind of key legislative planks in our broader economy. So I guess my long way of answering it is, what position, again, statements are we going to end up seeing in Canada that either come directly from government or from a government, or again, set that vision for the data and the platform economy, or find, the platform economy writ large. The last thing I meant to say, which is why I was looking at my scribbles, very difficult to read my handwriting, unfortunately. One of the ways Canada doesn't have tension in this debate is because, the largest technology firms that are always in the crossfire tend to be American, right? They've been othered in a lot of ways in the EU, UK. Maybe it's politically easier to go after them. So perhaps to imagine the tension that the US might be feeling, or other jurisdictions, ask ourselves as Canadians, do we ever see a universe where our own regulator would ask whether it is anti-competitive that through a Shopify app you use their proprietary payment system, right? That's an example of like applying a case, taking a case from another jurisdiction and asking, to what extent would it be true here? Does that same ethos hold? That's a way to kind of have imaginative conversations about something that is very complex and difficult to enter. So I took it from Tim Hortons to maybe another, Canadian-esque, formerly Canadian company, the Tim Hortons, to thinking about what it feels like to have our hometown hero under potential antitrust scrutiny, right? And how that might alter how we look at the law, perhaps.
I think they'd live. If I can follow up, I'd just say that the difficulty with this question about whether the Competition Bureau should sort of flow into areas that seem to be developing with use of data in a abusive dominant way or otherwise to create monopolies, the temptation is just say yes from a consumer point of view, because we haven't got anything else. We have no FTC in Canada. Hello. So at the federal level, there is no consumer protection. I love it when people chuck around the word, don't worry, consumer protection will look after the rest of it. There isn't any. I know, because I do this all day long, every day, and there isn't any general consumer protection at the federal level to just act as a decent business. There is at the provincial level, but the second they go after a federal entity, they say, sorry, we're federal, not provincial, so leave us alone. And there's endless battles in constitutional court as to whether Bell Canada, for example, is covered by, Quebec consumer protection legislation on contracts. Not a useful thing. I think the giant sucking hole in the middle of all this from a consumer point of view is we have no center. There is no consumer protection at the federal level. We need to follow the US lead. We would have to have an FTC. We don't have one. And I don't think that you can get over the constitutional hurdles and leave it to the provinces. So that is the difficulty. So it leaves you with the temptation to load up the Competition Bureau with as much as possible from a consumer point of view. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is to run to the class action bar, which is, got its own goals and axes to grind. And then the other way it could go is you could try to empower a digital commissioner, as was talked about. And I think that, John, you mentioned it as something that came and went. I don't know if it ever was serious, but maybe that's what the government meant by the digital commission. They would become the head of this new sort of amorphous agency that would look either after platforms or after consumers or something digital. I wasn't quite clear. But without that piece, I think we're going to have a lot of pressure to load a lot on the Competition Bureau, and then perhaps a lot on some sectoral regulators like CRTC that still exist there. So it makes it unstable in Canada. Kind of all sloshes one way or all sloshes back the other way. That's the way I'm viewing the question of how much new stuff we can put into the Competition Act.
John, is it okay if I just
an
comment?
MOU.
Go ahead, Bass. Go ahead, Bass.
Guys, I was being so boring. I was just going to put forward there's a memorandum of understanding between the Competition Bureau and the Provincial Consumer Protection Authority. There are issues that they collaborate on and chat about. So there's some coordination, but I also think it's interesting and important to point to that we've decoupled competition considerations from consumer protection, and other jurisdictions take a different approach, right?
Well,
Which
hang-
influences the
hang on.
conversations.
That's where I was going to come in. I was
That's
going to
not-
correct
Go,
this.
John.
There's been some disinformation put out here. So the Competition Bureau does have consumer protection responsibilities. It's responsible for the deceptive and marketing advertising provisions of the Act. Things like drip pricing, it's tacked that and was successful in having a number of settlements. AstroTurfing against Bell. Ringtone issues against all the major telco companies. Those are consumer protection issues. The Bureau has a third of its resources working on consumer protection issues in the deceptive and marketing space. We do a lot of joint work with the FTC. We are parallel with the FTC. The only difference between us and the FTC is we don't have market study powers and we don't have privacy legislation. We have a separate privacy commissioner. The FTC has that responsibility. But on the consumer protection side, for the most part, the Competition Bureau has the same role as the FTC. So there are other areas of consumer protection that the Bureau doesn't cover, and that I'm not sure if the FTC covers them. Some of the provinces cover them. This might be the area you're talking about, John, the gap spots where the Bureau is not involved. But on deceptive and misleading advertising, the Bureau is there and has been taking action for years, since 1984, since I was working there.
Elisa?
That's what I was going to just make sure. I thought, John, that's why you were putting your hand up. But I do think it does, to John Lawford's point, there is the issue about federal legislation cannot have prescribed regulation in a particular industry or sector, which would be the sole authority of the provinces. And I think we would need to consider whether or not that type of prescribed regulation is necessary in a digital economy, or if the consumer harm that you're thinking about can be addressed through the deceptive marketing and other consumer protection provisions that the Bureau does have. But to your point, John, it hasn't been a considerable part of the discussion, and it should be. That role that the Bureau plays, as John says, is a significant one within the Bureau. And I think there is room for them to sort of stand up at this table and participate in this discussion. But to the question, Alexandra, that you raised, I did want to make one point and then develop the discussion around the institutional distinctions that John and Vas mentioned. The one point I just wanted to flag is that although there are so far some countries, the EU and a couple of European members, that have adopted specific platform regulation, to my knowledge, they are either still in draft or extremely new, and they are targeting defined and identified platforms. It's not the platform economy writ large. They are targeting gatekeepers, or they're targeting companies with strategic market status. So you get around definitional issues before you even start drafting the legislation. Is who is this legislation going to apply to? And if it fits the definition on day one, is it still going to fit the definition in year 2 or year 3 or year 4? So from a legislative perspective, I think that's complex. But on the institutional point, I think I thought you were going to go here. You went a little in a different direction. But I think the other thing that's important for Canada is we have marketplace distinctions. So not only are our institutions very different from Europe, but the marketplace, the way that Canadian companies and American companies interact in a North American or a global economy, are very unique than in Europe. And I don't think we can lose that thought. So we can decide that from an institutional perspective, or from a policy perspective rather, we like what Europe has done. We look at our institutions and realize that they're very different and it may not be appropriate. But then we also have to look at the marketplace. The UK is probably got an integrated market to Germany and to France. It just left Europe. It has to adopt its laws now as a United Kingdom, but still interact with a European marketplace. In Canada, as a consumer, the architecture, the infrastructure of the companies that we're purchasing from may be Canadian, or they may not. There may be a Canadian standalone website. We may be purchasing straight from the US. The companies may have assets and business in Canada. They may not. So I think that's why we very much look to the US. It's not only the institutional history, but our marketplaces are so intertwined. And I don't think we can lose that when we're designing our own regulatory framework.
Mm-hmm. Since we're on the topic of Europe, I want to throw to one of these audience questions here, which is, should and could the Bureau ever put conditions on a merger akin to the EU's Google Fitbit hold separate order on Fitbit data? If it should, and already could, should it bring it to the OPC, bring in the OPC to help make that call?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. I think the Bureau can. I mean, it does have the ability to create behavioral orders that are, blessed by the Competition Tribunal. They don't like doing it because it requires some oversight. They become like a regulator, and that takes their resources away from doing law enforcement, which is their primary mandate. But in theory, they could come up with a similar type of an order against Fitbit and Google. Could they bring in the privacy commissioner? Well, that one I don't believe so, because the privacy commissioner is not a law enforcement agency at this point in time. So they're not entitled to see the confidential information that the Bureau would have. So I think it would be a challenge just at that superficial level. But Elisa, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the OPC getting involved in a consent order and a merger review.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, is it necessary? I mean, do you need the insight of the OPC to say that consumers have concern with their data, et cetera? I mean, I think the Bureau would hear that from others. But I think there are information sharing restrictions, as John pointed out, between the Bureau and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner that should probably be addressed in this next round of consultations. In some cases it makes sense, and in other cases it doesn't. And the Bureau and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner have a close working relationship. So there shouldn't be artificial impediments if there's a valid need for discussion. I think one thing John said I thought I would pick up on is the Bureau's sort of hesitation to impose behavioral remedies because of the resource constraint. And John, you mentioned the UK approach to codes of conduct, and I think that's an interesting angle for us to look at, because behavioral remedies can also be reinforced by industry standards and industry codes. And you're already seeing in the digital space platforms working towards different types of codes. If they can be encouraged to do so by regulatory pressure, potential actual live situations where a behavioral remedy may be appropriate, then I think they can themselves support a more continued use of behavioral remedies, which would address perhaps that resource constraint that the regulators are feeling.
Data silos, that data silo as a potential remedy reminds me of is that, that really seems like an articulation of a particular vision for the role of data and competition overall that was able to be articulated through that. So I think it's another example of potential policy intervention or angle that can only come out of the kind of legislative review we're going into, again, and research and kind of thinking about where this one piece of legislation fits in our broader approach to the digital economy in Canada. That is I like the, made in Canada approach. I think we can get there, and we shouldn't, though we're falling a little bit behind as reflected in a recent G7 compendium. That's okay, right? There's lots to learn, and we don't write legislation in stone, at least not anymore. So we can kind of iterate and get better incrementally. It feels so momentous that we're having this review of the Act, but maybe we could do a better job maintaining the legislation that we have over time as we do the Banking Act.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to the next question here, which asks, are fears of overreaching competition policy founded on evidence or orthodoxy? What case studies or evidence can be pointed to that stronger competition policy would adversely affect market efficiency / innovation?
I don't know. Maybe the other two professionals on this thing who do competition law every day could answer, but my fear is this question is going to be one that's polemical. I mean, people are just going to say, of course, of course any interference has to be justified because competition, that's why we're here. So it really comes down to, like, what do you think when you talk competition policy, what are you doing? It's that fundamental. That's what this question is. So I'm not sure between the attendees we're going to get the same answer. Like, again, for us, competition policy is to get to good prices and choice for consumers. Whereas I think for some people in the space, it is, no, if there's a perfectly functioning market, maybe even with just one provider, a total monopolist, it could be a great market. And it might cost consumers a lot of money. But from the lens that's been put on to date, I feel like they're happy with that result because that is competition policy. And the reason why we resist sometimes the Competition Bureau coming in to say regulatory proceedings is because if you take their point of view, then they win the argument because they've just set the parameters of what we want to achieve. And at least in something like a CRTC here, I can say, well, that's a perfect market you're designing there, but it sounds like Bell Canada and Rogers to me. And it's not enough for consumers because we tend to find where just Bell Canada and Rogers are, the prices might be a bit higher than when there's 2 or 3 more providers. So I feel like this is kind of like a motherhood question. I don't know how else to answer it. Depends on what you think of competition policy.
John, do you want to take? I mean, I think I would. The question has unfortunately disappeared, so I couldn't reread it. I think I would look at it a little bit differently. I mean, often in the digital economy, consumer price is not the issue. Consumer prices are often quite low and free, and it's in the short term anyway. That's not necessarily where the concern lies. Some people would argue that there may be long-term effects because while the prices are free now or low, as market power expands and there's less choice of different players in the market, then prices could increase. I think that's still to be seen. But I think it does go to the question was, do we have any support? I think it was for showing that there could be an impact on innovation from having overregulation, and I think overregulation anywhere is inefficient. It imposes regulatory barriers. There's a ton written on this, but you can see it in the way that that businesses conduct themselves. So if we take the data silo, for example. At what point does a data silo become imposed? And at what point is that hindering innovation and use of that data? At what point is that appropriate? At what point do you take that away? And who do you take it away from? And if you take it away from the person with market power, is the person who's right nipping at their heels able to then take advantage of it? And how does that impact the innovation in the economy? Because often companies are nipping at people's heels because they're competing with the others in the marketplace. And so I think there's just a general softening of competitive dynamic that's imposed by regulatory barriers or impositions or stop conduct orders and things like that.
Yeah, my view is it would be helpful to have both the evidence and, of course, the theory behind developing a coherent law and policy. Clearly, in the digital space, many of the jurisdictions have done that. They've drilled down, done in-depth market studies, reports of 400 pages, looking at the various issues from which policymakers could use, in addition to traditional orthodoxy and theory, industrial organization, to come up with revised legislation. Unfortunately, I don't think Canada's going to be able to rely on any evidence. I'm not aware of any of these detailed studies in the digital space of the nature that we see in the US or the UK. So we'll have to rely on them. Given that you're dealing with digital giants that are multinational, some of that can spill over and be pertinent to Canada. Some of it might not. But I think any legislation should be a combination of both. Quite frankly, that's it. I think that would be the way to go forward if you can.
To John Lawford's points, John, what I'm hearing you kind of asking about is, how do we differentiate between an efficient economy and an exploitative economy? Maybe that's kind of a lens for some of your consumer considerations that you're bringing forward in terms of competition in a digital context, because we've spoken a lot about consumers and the platforms themselves, but we haven't really had time, and we don't have time on this panel, that's okay, to dig into maybe some of the needs or interests or barriers that entrepreneurs and smaller businesses experience when we force them, when they do compete in this platform economy. And it has been basically a public policy in Canada. We've pushed more small businesses online, which is good. That was overdue in terms of the digital adoption and the programs that we had, but we've done very little to articulate what it means to compete in a platform economy, in a digital marketplace, and kind of what else the role of the state is there. So I think that's going to be a bigger part of the capital C conversation moving forward as well.
And that's actually one of the questions here is how could competition reform be used to empower digital small and medium enterprises and startups in light of the de facto market power that bigger players like Amazon possess? So I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in on that one.
One of the examples, and we are starved for a lot of the government-led research that we've seen in other jurisdictions, but one of the examples in what was earlier referred to as the Vivek report, and I'm one of the co-authors on that we looked at, was something called copycatting. It's not necessarily an anti-competitive activity, right? It's not necessarily something that fits under the act, but we looked at it from the perspective of smaller competitors who, that price of competing online or in a marketplace is the particular vulnerability from additional data that can be, or naturally has to be perhaps, collected about you when you're in that marketplace. So in terms of empowerment, if we had a better, again, articulation or more appropriate guardrails, we could avoid the kind of supercharged replication and kind of market discipline that we see, right? So though imitation and knockoffs, not historically new at all, in fact, a form of flattery and part of competing, right? That somebody will notice something that's popular, and we see this happening with Shopify merchants who go direct to consumer and might find themselves replicated through something like Amazon Basics. So maybe that's, again, back to the Plinko, an example of why small and medium-sized enterprises might struggle. Or maybe that's just the price of the pleasure and the privilege of competing on dominant platforms to find your marketplace. But again, it's not just the biggest companies, the largest digital companies that are engaging in this behavior. We've got all kinds of platforms that are open to third-party competitors in Canada that are Canadian Tire, Mark's Work Wearhouse, now apparently just Mark's, Loblaw, etc., which again forces us, I think, or compels us to start to use our legislative tools to ask similar questions that other jurisdictions are asking, and think about, again, what does it mean to compete in the platform economy? And also, what does it mean to shop and exist in a platform economy?
But I think the issue on this one is that small competitors to platforms who are also selling the same thing. In other words, if you have a platform, but you're also, this is the wholesale retail problem. So if you have the network and you also sell retail on it, then you watch what competitors, you have access to all the information of your competitors who post their ad on your platform, and you watch how well it sells, to whom it's sold. You have all that information which you wouldn't normally get if they were a separate operating business, not platformed on your platform, if I can use it that way. And the question is it appropriate to make Amazon put I can't think of a non-racial way to put this, but a wall between their information on the retail side and, if you will, their wholesale side, so they can't use that competing retailer's information to then set up their own product or tailor it to the audience that bought the other product. And we stopped in the old days. Bell Canada wasn't allowed to be in the computer business for this reason, and they weren't allowed to run broadcasting for this reason, and they weren't allowed to do lots of things because they were also a network provider platform. So to me, this small business question, this is one of those areas where I can only think of the Competition Bureau as being the right party to look into that kind of an allegation that Amazon looked at who I sold to and then they tailored their product to steal my market, because you hear that a lot from small providers.
Right, but
Yeah,
so this
go ahead.
This goes back to John's original comment, is that the Competition Act as currently crafted, with tweaks potentially around different standards, is able to deal with this type of issue. And I believe there have been cases akin to this. And I mean, the example made me think of way before the platform economy, private label products on retail grocery shelves. I think there were similar allegations where the private label product would offer consumers a lower price for the same product as a national brand, perhaps stealing their secret sauce. I don't know. But in any event, the Competition Act, as it's currently constituted can address this type of conduct. Again, it comes back to the standard that we'll be discussing in the consultation. And I think, Vas, you used a word that is very, very rarely used in Canada, but it's going to creep into the debate, I assume, and that's that of exploitative abuses. That's a standard that exists in Europe. It doesn't exist in Canada today. We have discriminatory abuses, exclusionary abuses, predatory abuses, but exploitative does not exist in our law, and maybe it should. I suspect that'll be part of the consultation and may, I guess, as John said, sort of tweak or make more efficient and effective the act as it exists for the types of issues that we're seeing in the platform economy. But it doesn't suggest to me the need for ex ante regulation to address some of the conduct.
Yeah, if I can just follow on the same issue. And again, I support Lisa, what she's saying regarding if we make our laws more effective, that's the best way to empower the small and medium-sized enterprises, make it more quick moving. So we react, before a 10-year period's expired. So they can resolve the problems more quickly through, having the tools such as injunctions and arbitration for quick decisions. I think that will help. Because right now, cases take years, 7, 8, 10 years, and here the small and medium-sized enterprise the issue is not being dealt with or remedied, and they could go out of business in the interim. The other issue is, to ensure that these complainants, there's no retribution in the market for them coming forward and dealing with the Competition Bureau and the authorities. I think there's a lot of hesitancy amongst small businesses to go to government to be the rat, and then be perceived as the rat in the industry for end of time. So I think that does create a lot of hesitancy for companies to come forward. So some type of protections there or just a change in culture, like we see on other issues, just that, this is an appropriate response to having concerns in a market is going to your government as opposed to being seen to be weak, for example. I think there's a perception issue there. So those are a couple of areas. And then just on this copycat issue, I know Vas is written on it. And John, you're alluding to it. Again, they're IP laws. If one company is stealing someone else's secret sauce, there are IP protections and laws to deal with that. That to me is the primary tool. It can be added to an anti-competitive argument, but the primary tool is IP law. And again, I don't understand why that doesn't come up in the conversation. I think that's an important consideration.
It's in our Vivek report as well. It's part of touching on those intersectionalities, right? So yeah, in certain instances that might be the lead, but it's an issue that ends up being related to competition. So thanks for mentioning that. And I just wanted to mention, the Bureau was seeking some input from Amazon sellers a couple of years ago. I put that link there. And in terms of, the tools and the ability that the Bureau has to learn about, to learn from people that want to report something or experiencing something are limited. So as John's saying, yes, we should better protect people that do come forward or be more clear about making sure we're educating people and kind of keeping public education up around what anti-competitive conduct is, how to recognize it, and then what recourse you might have.
So we are almost out of time, but I want to do a couple more questions. So maybe let's do kind of a rapid fire round. So just keep your comments very concise. So the lack of a Canadian market study power, I think it should be market power study, has been brought up a couple of times. Why isn't there an ability to complete market studies by the Canadian Competition Authority? Should there be? Could there be? So maybe John Peckman could take that one.
Sure, absolutely. I spoke on this topic on Friday. So the law does not contain a provision that authorizes the Bureau to conduct market studies in the first instance. They're doing a few with the scarce resources they have, obtaining information on a voluntary basis. So the studies that they do are low-hanging fruit, not overly robust because they're just relying on public data. Most of the important data is pricing data, which is contained and held by the companies, and they won't provide that unless they're compelled. So market studies inform policymakers about the need for changes in legislation, whether it be in competition law or in another sector where there are restraints to competition. These studies help identify those. In my mind, public restraints to competition are have the largest impact on competition or the economy. than any private restraints could. And so this is such an important tool to improve our competitiveness. Bill Morneau just spoke about that last week, about how Canada's falling behind on its competitiveness, yet we're not making any strides in developing a competitiveness council, promoting competition through advocacy with, stronger tools and stronger recommendations to policymakers. I think this is a huge gap in our current legislation, identified in 2008 by the Wilson Report, but nothing was done. And they recommended the creation of an advocacy group with powers and a competitiveness council, and I fully support that.
Mm-hmm. This one, maybe I'll toss to John Lawford. Mr. Lawford described a situation where accumulation of data can lead to market dominance or monopoly without any mergers and without necessarily abusive conduct, just superior performance. Should competition law come into the picture? And if not, what is the solution?
Well, because I posited it, I think yes. And the reason why is because monopoly. At some point, everybody said, oh, well, there's no monopolies in Canada. Yes, there are. There's effective monopolies. There's oligopolies where there's 3 perfectly divided markets and so stable that they last for 20, 30 years in huge areas of the economy. That's the issue. That's the issue and the reason why I was raising that. And the new platforms, because they've got the feedback loop of personal information, which, by the way, things like telcos really want to get their hooks into as well, because they see how well it works. It can be one. It can be effectively Amazon for retail online. It can effectively be Apple for hardware, computer stuff. Effectively. Now, there might be some people with 1% market share somewhere. Are they putting any pressure on pricing or on choice in the market? No, not really. So what are we missing? I think we're missing the innovation and the lower prices and the choice that you would get with a more equal market and higher HH or lower HHI. So that's what I'm talking about with that. And some may disagree and just say winner takes all. And according to competition theory, it's cool, but those are the reasons why I'm against it.
Elisa or Vast, does either of you want to weigh in on that one?
I'm forgetting the question, so not me.
Okay,
I'll
sure.
let you know.
I mean, look, I think if it depends on if the question is superior competitive performance leading to a substantial lessening of competition or not. If it's not, or if it is, I think that's a situation where we're trying to consider, is the Competition Act as currently drafted sufficient? If it's not, I don't know what the problem is. You may have superior competitive performance, but you have low prices, you continue to have innovation. So I don't know, what are we addressing there? But if we're in a situation where superior competitive performance has resulted in an adverse effect on competition or a substantial lessening of competition or whatever the standard is going to be, but it is not the result of an anti-competitive act, then we may have a gap. And if we have a gap, how do we address it? And do we address that by revising the definition of anti-competitive act, or is there no issue to be addressed? So I think this is the topic. This is a topic that will be as part of the consultation in the next round.
And then the last question we have here is around market failure. Is market failure the appropriate threshold for this competition policy debate? Why can't Facebook's influence on recent elections as a de facto town square be a sufficient societal ill to justify a competition policy response?
I mean,
Well,
I'll just offer that that's an example of us asking too much, or asking the Competition Act to do something that maybe it's not intended to. I would have anticipated a question around Facebook and merger reviews, or the role of data in merger reviews, right? As we look for other calls from other jurisdictions to break up Facebook or separate, WhatsApp, etc. And I'll just add, while we have, we might have underutilized legislative tools that are complementary to the act that we're not bringing forward, there's not a lack of regulation in the platform economy, right? It's just without us articulating our vision for that platform economy from a policy perspective, we have the private actors end up being the de facto regulators, right? And maybe that's a lasting part of the conversation to remind ourselves. Just because we have not taken a particular policy stance as Canadians or taken a particular case forward doesn't mean that there aren't rules governing these marketplaces, but there are rules that are created by different actors in different ways. I'll turn it, to John. Do you want to talk Facebook?
Oh yes, it's just, and I think you nailed it, Vass, in terms of the all-encompassing role of competition law. Should it also protect democracy? Is that should be part of its mandate? A diversity of voices and the content of publications and screening through all the material that's being written. I don't think that's ever been contemplated in competition laws. Some may say there can be a regulator like our CRTC regulates for Canadian content. That may be appropriate location or policy house for that type of issue if you want to go there. But again, I think traditionally competition laws have dealt with issues like quality, quantity, consumer choice, pricing. Those are the issues on products and goods and services. When you start getting into these areas of income inequality, so even some of the labor issues, there are other laws that are better suited to deal with those issues. Competition laws are not set up for them. And once you start bringing in those issues, it's complicated enough, as I said, just to assess the competition issues and do a rigorous analysis. How are you going to weigh in these other factors? It's just how do you do it properly and transparently and with some certainty so business can function and go forward. Again, I know there are opponents that want to throw everything in, cure all the social ills with the current upcoming competition law amendments. I'm not in that camp. Mercy.
I do have I do have one more of my own, and maybe this will be the last question, which is how does the split between federal and provincial jurisdictions in Canada affect how we approach these issues? If you look at Canada, we've had this inability to set up national bodies like securities regulators. We have a provincial system. So how does that kind of affect the Canadian landscape on the competition front?
I mean, look, maybe we're going to find some efficiencies in terms of how we implement our competition laws, right? And maybe that's a lens to think about what the role for the provinces is or could be. I pointed to that memorandum of understanding between Ontario's Consumer Protection Authority and the Federal Competition Bureau. Yes, it's worth recognizing we've decoupled those considerations, but the other benefit to an all-of-government approach is it kind of takes the heat off one person who's also responsible for regulating industry overall, where we've nested the Bureau under ISED. And I know there have been longstanding calls. There are a lot of kind of zombie arguments in the competition mix, right? And one of those, and no disrespect to zombies, but just an argument that has been around for a very long time, that maybe we could have more independence and a little bit more authority for our competition commissioner. But again, if and as we have that conversation about where the Competition Act situates here, but again, what's an all-of-government approach to appropriate regulations that protect consumers and foster responsible innovation in the digital economy, yeah, I think there's going to be a role for complementary, supportive role for other ministries, other policy levers as we're talking about, but it's up to us to build that kind of interoperable policy environment. It's not going to happen by accident. It could be a happy accident, but it's going to take work, and that could be something that Canada can at least envision to our advantage.
Bane of my existence, federal provincial consumer protection conflicts. And the way to solve it is to rip out the parts John and Lisa are talking about from the Competition Bureau that are doing, false advertising and all that consumer stuff. Call it Canada's FTC. Make it interact in a standing intergovernmental cooperation forum with the provincial people. And I don't know how to do that. We do it with Milk Marketing Board. I guess we can do it here, and give it a push, because at the moment, nothing's happening federal, provincial, and as soon as the push comes to shove and you say, well, the Competition Bureau is getting involved, then the provinces get pulled back and they don't want to deal with it. And then likewise, the Competition Bureau doesn't want to step on provincial toes. So it's a real disaster at the moment. And I think that might be one way to start moving it towards higher intergovernmental cooperation, which is what we need, especially if you're going to say some things are not appropriate to stuff into the Competition Act because they're really consumer protection issues. Well, then we better segregate them and deal with them very deeply and very cooperatively. That's what I would say on this one.
Yeah, and in my view, I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to qualify my comments. There's the Constitution Act that divides powers. Trade and commerce falls to the feds for the most part if there's interprovincial commerce involved. And so we do see, funny divisions, particularly on the consumer protection side in terms of what is going to the feds, what's the province doing. And we're also seeing it in privacy. The three of the provinces have their own privacy legislation. And in fact, Quebec has a GDPR legislation that's going to come in force in effect very soon. And of course, the feds are still not there. So there's a total disconnect on the privacy piece. So this is real. It is shaped a little bit by the Constitution and the jurisprudence in the mark. There's a Supreme Court of Canada decision in General Motors and National Leasing that explains that there's legislation that targets, an industry that they may be offside the Constitution as well and outside of federal powers. Should be more local because there's it's a very complicated area given the way the country was set up. And I don't know if we'll be able to navigate all of those issues in our consultation, but I'm sure it'll come up. So I think it's an appropriate question. I don't have the solution, so I can't give you one. I just think that, we need to cooperate, work together. Can't we just all get along? Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
Elisa, any thoughts on this last one?
Not a great way to end the panel. No, look, I think there are distinguishing features of the Canadian landscape that need to be kept in mind if legislation is drafted to ensure that we don't trip on any constitutional issues. But I think there are arguments likely on both sides of the coin. The digital economy is certainly crosses provincial boundaries and is more than industry or sector specific. So as long as that is kept in mind, when any federal revisions are proposed, then I think that it's workable. But as John said, there is a 6-part test that needs to be established, or there will be lawsuits. And even if drafters do their best, there will probably be someone who challenges it. So it's another hurdle to overcome as we move to the next stages of this process.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but a big thanks to our speakers for a thoughtful and enlightening discussion, to the Canadian IGF All Hands Committee for organizing this event, and most of all to our participants for joining us today. The Canadian IGF will host another event this June called Safety First, Approaching Internet Content Regulation in Canada, which will act as a follow-up to the November event, Regulating Online Harms in Canada, and will focus on the government's development of their second proposal to make safer spaces online by managing illegal and harmful content. And please follow at Canadian IGF on Twitter and Facebook for updates and registration for that. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your week, everyone.